Assalamu alaikum. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I think that was the same introduction you used the last time I was here. I still haven't updated the website, I think. So let me say first, thank you for the invitation to come back. And the fact that I have been invited back is already a good sign, because I know how tough an audience this is. I still remember when I was sent the evaluation forms at the end of the last talk. Yes. I won't make any comments on the. With that in mind, I did actually even consider cancelling today, because seriously, I've been ill for the last 4 days, and I thought, rather than do a lecture without shortchanging any of you, I hope what I'm going to do is to do a talk. And I hope that is something that works better, especially because I know what a participative audience you are, in terms of you all have very strong views on things. And I tried to choose a subject which would directly be one of those on which all of you have views. I saw Jamil, as always, preparing his notebook with the date and title of the talk, and that already makes me shiver in fear at the thought of what he's going to put down. I thought that in order to perhaps give a hint of the title, for those of you who haven't guessed yet, and of course there are many possible meanings to pick up from it, I'll just do 1 quick minute of something, if this works. What was it? Alt tab. Alt tab. It is working.
Right. Do you not want the video?
Yeah, just the sound. It's not that important. We'll switch it off. Don't worry. Don't worry. No, let's just cancel it. It's not worth it. It's not that important. You all know it. The opening cadences of it. Yeah, technology is not worth it. Okay. Okay, let's go back to the real stuff. No showing. Okay, so what I want to do is actually, this is actually in 2 parts, and for me, they are as important one as the other. The first one is I want you to think a little bit about what I'm calling history matters, and matters of history and why history matters. And I want us to think about it along 4 different ways. Each one of them, for those of you who are interested, will sort of, I chose a little title that's resonant, of someone who has thought and written a great deal about this, often in a controversial way, often in a polemical way, often in a way that has marked the way that we continue to talk about it. So one of the things would be how in the 19th century, which we often speak of as the century of history, the century that discovered history, the century that had an overwhelming consciousness of the way that history means that we live in the present in ways that were different from the past, and that the past shapes the way that you think of the future. Nietzsche did this meditation or reflection, what he called an untimely meditation on the question of history. And he suggested that basically there were 3 kinds of attitudes that people took to the past. There was a sort of the great man notion of history, that he turns to the past to look for examples of what he is going to re-embody and reenact in the present. So sort of the past gives us the lessons of greatness that can be represented in the present by the great souls who can make it happen. There's a sort of reverential attitude to the past, where you sort of simply have to be in awe of what has already happened. And then there's the version which is the critical version of history, in which traducing a little bit what he was trying to argue, but in ways that you will be very sort of familiar with. The notion that perhaps the past and the notion of history can actually be like a tomb that weighs upon us. It almost stifles the way that we live in the present because we have too much past to deal with. And so the question is, how can you make room in the present to actually think anew, open new futures in ways that are not beholden to the past? So one of the questions that I want us to think a little bit about in relation to what I'm going to talk later is how much that past weighs on us. How much does the sort of the charge that so often falls upon Muslims, that they are a people who are beholden by the past, who are nostalgic for the past, whose time has passed and who have to open new ways of thinking. How much is this sort of still caught up in these ways of thinking about history? The second one is to do with what Charles Mills called the sociological imagination, which is really sort of about getting people to emancipate themselves by realizing that the way in which we see our biography, the way that we see our life, the way that our fate seems to take place, is not really the product of our individual particular biographies, but the way that our lives are structured in relation to history, in relation to society, in relation to the kinds of things that enable and disable our possibilities for moving in the world. So instead of us seeing ourselves, each one of us, as some sort of in the luck of the stars or of our particular circumstances, we have to see ourselves in relation to larger forces, in relation to collectivities, in relation to structural disadvantages, in relation to a global system. So connect your local, your specific, your individual with larger structures of history, of society, and so on. The third one will be very familiar to those of you who are particularly interested in questions which link to colonialism, post-colonialism. The name should evoke, the title, Return to the Source, should evoke the name of Amilcar Cabral, the great revolutionary thinker, as well as Fanon. And the notion is, when nations that have been colonized try to overthrow colonialism, try to achieve their independence, one of the things that they must do in the course of achieving their emancipation is to decolonize their cultures, to decolonize themselves. Because colonialism also works through a process of colonizing culture, of robbing culture, of deracinating people, of taking away people's roots and senses of self. And so the question then becomes, so when you emancipate yourself, when you overthrow this colonizing power, what is it that you do? Do you go back to some sort of notion of authenticity? Do you go back to the post-colonial past? Do you erase that culture that was now considered foreign and external and sort of return to some sort of authenticity? Or are we aware and realize that, of course, there is no post-colonial return to a pre-colonial? The nation state changes everything, colonial boundaries change everything, contacts of cultures change everything, and there's really no going back. So the notion of return to the source is not a looping back, it's not a sort of shifting back in time, it's a replenishing from that vital source that was there, that created a sense of what cultures had and enables connecting with the transformations that have occurred, but in order to propel into the future. So 3 different things so far that we've already been picking up on. This one, Whose Heritage, is a very famous and very productive and constructive intervention by Stuart Hall, one of the greatest black intellectuals of the 20th century, if not the 21st as well, and in which basically he tried to get us to think about how to unsettle the concept of heritage, so that instead of seeing nation states as somehow having their concept of what makes them a cultural commonality, a sense of belonging and identification on the basis of the past, when the present demographically has changed, when culturally it has changed, when it has become plural, diverse, when it has been open to immigration, when it has been open to religious, cultural, many different kinds of diversity and difference and plurality. How do you bring your relationship to the past to reflect this? How do you create common conceptions of a past which is not exclusive of all those who in the present are more plural? So the notion is heritage is itself not fixed. That's the interesting and important thing to think about, that the present doesn't look back to a past that is fixed, but the past must itself open up to enable all those who currently and participatively exist in a culture, in a society, in a commonality, can draw on its resources in order to feel a collective belonging. So the notion would be not only, of course, to challenge the notions that Britain only became a plural country post-1945 with the Windrush generation, or later when the arrival of Asians, so after blacks, Asians, and then Eastern Europeans and so on, but instead to see how history has always been more diversely made by many who are part of it, but especially so that when you say these are the monuments that we associate with our country, these are the legacies, material, cultural, and of ideas that we associate with the nation that we feel an attachment to, there's something of us in it. There's something that we contribute to make it also. We're not sort of tourists who arrive here. We are part of those who have made a nation that we are a part of. And that connects very closely with the notion of a politics of belonging that is in the everyday, not just in terms of symbols, not just in terms of ideas, but, and I wanted to connect this directly with some of the ways in which we've been trying to, all of us, as parents, as children, as activists or not, to think about these things, which is, for example, the way that the curriculum in schools should reflect the different memberships of British society, the way that when you go to a museum, the kinds of artworks that are valued reflect all of this, the way that British heritage, in the way that it represents the kind of landscape, built landscape of this country, reflects all the different communities that live in it. And when I say in schools, I mention this in particular because I remember when we had the discussions about Michael Gove's reforms of the curriculum and the way that it was narrowing it down to a certain conception of a white-made Englishness, which was proud of the export of its civilization and values, including in the colonial period. And we were all challenging that with the notion that history has always been more globally made, and that what we consider British history has always been made elsewhere as well. One of the ways in which Muslims thought about this was to say, okay, so let's try and think about what would be strategically the key things that we would put on a curriculum that would enable that when Muslims study in schools, they can see we too are part of civilization, we too made the world that is ours today. And one of the ones that I remember having had a discussion about, I can't remember if Jamil was there, but one of the ones that we had a discussion about was when we had a discussion about one of those places and moments that is considered iconic. And that is what is often referred to and was referred to at that meeting as Muslim Spain. And I remember I said that if we were going to push for it, I didn't want it to be pushed for as Muslim Spain. I wanted for it to be pushed as Al-Andalus. And I remember that at that meeting, someone said, Al-Andalus won't work because nobody knows what that is. And there's a particular reason why I mentioned that anecdote. And that's because having got you to try and think a little bit about the ways in which I think history matters, and in which history continues to be alive in all the ways in which we talk about being Muslims in our societies and thinking about the past and thinking about how the past matters, Al-Andalus is something that appears to be a touchstone to a lot of people's sense of what is valued. I went to, there are these Islamic courses that are run in London every month. They're very successful, and I understand that they're very popular. I went for the first time on Saturday to a course on Al-Andalus, an extremely well-run course. And what I was surprised by was the absolutely full room. And I was told by one of the organizers that it was not that common to have that many people, and it was probably the topic and the theme that drew that many people. I've done at least 2 other talks on Al-Andalus, and they always tend to resonate with people. And how many of you have been to Spain and sort of had a sense of being in Islamic Spain? And there's a notion that there is something there that speaks to us. And the first thing that I wanted to do with this topic of Al-Andalus that I want to touch on briefly, and I'm not going to touch on it as a medievalist. I'm not interested in the specifics and the particularities of the history of that period. I'm interested in the ways in which that period continues to resonate, has continued to resonate, and continues to resonate for us. First thing I want to do is a couple of disorientations. And the first one would be, so if you look at some of the, I'm not talking about popular works, I'm talking about some of the academic works, the really good histories that you can read on it. We can start with the name. If we look at one of the classic ones, when the Edinburgh surveys of Islamic civilization and general history started after the Second World War, the history of Islamic Spain was first done by Montgomery Watt and Pierre Cachy, and you can see that the title there was a history of Islamic Spain. If we look at another quite well-received work, which is Richard Fletcher's, it was called Moorish Spain, and Hugh Kennedy's very well-regarded volume is called Muslim Spain and Portugal. Now, do you notice anything in the names? History of Islamic Spain, Moorish Spain, Muslim Spain and Portugal. If you look at another one, this is a Portuguese version. This is called Portugal in Arabic Spain, an even more complicated construction there. That one's from a really standard collection of documents from 72 to 74. So if you look at this, you've got Islamic Spain, Moorish Spain, Muslim Spain and Portugal, Islamic Iberia. Look at the variety of different terms that I used in order to designate this entity that we are trying to speak of. And then to complicate things further, of course, we've got the concept of Sepharad, in its Spanish and Spanish-derived version, and Sepharad in the English, which, of course, if you look at the Society for Sephardic Studies, the definition of Sepharad is the meaning of the term, which is the entire Iberian Peninsula consisting of today's Spain and Portugal. So that's not, of course, reducible to the period of Muslim rule of the Iberian Peninsula, but it is a period for which, as we will see, a particular moment of resonance is the one in which Muslims ruled the peninsula. So one way of getting around this is to say that we're talking about a place that's multiply named: Al-Andalus, Sepharad, medieval Iberia, Spain, Portugal. But that it matters which name you use. If we look at the question of Spain and Portugal, then the obvious one should be clear to you, which is both Spain and Portugal, as nation-states as they exist today, with their geographies, with their territorialities, with their frontiers, did not exist when Al-Andalus existed. They're both nations that existed, that came into existence in the process of unmaking Al-Andalus. And so when we speak about Andalus being Muslim Spain, that's a very contorted construction, because, of course, there was no Spain at the time. And one of the problems, which is a more common one, but it's important for us to remember, is that if you project back and we take into consideration the fact that both Portugal and Spain were made by the erasure of the Muslim presence, the creation of Portugal and Spain is a north-south process of erasing the Muslim frontier, then it becomes a very contorted construction to speak about Muslim Spain. And we will see that one of the debates, in fact, I can already mention it now, one of the debates that is sort of central to Spanish historiography, which is known as the Americo Castro, Claudio Sanchez Albornoz debate, is the question of, so what impact, if any, did the Muslim presence in the Iberian Peninsula have for the making of Spain, for Spanishness, for Spain? And for one of them, Antonio Castro, who is the man who coined the term convivencia, of which we speak so much, it was a fundamental thing. That crucible of the presence of the three peoples, Christians, Muslims, and Jews, is crucial to the way in which Spain came out to be what it is today. For Claudio Sanchez Albornoz, the Muslim presence in Spain had no impact whatsoever. Spain was distorted by the presence of the Muslims, and it could only be Spain when it finally removed the Muslims. So it had to go back to the Visigothic precursors of the Muslim presence in order to return to its true essence and pick that up. Now, what are the ways in which we can name then what Al-Andalus is, if it is this contested space, this contested meaning, this contested? One way is to speak of time. We could say it's the period of the Muslim presence in the Iberian Peninsula from 711 to 1492. Of course, one of the best ways of immediately challenging that a little bit is by putting the Hijri calendar instead of just the Christian calendar in order to, again, do a little bit of disorientation. But you all know that the period that we're talking about is Muslim presence in this place, which geographically we speak of as the Iberian Peninsula, in the period between the Arab invasion of 711 with Tariq ibn Ziyad until the expulsion of and the fall of the Nasrid state of Granada in 1492, January 2nd, the day of the conquest, the day of the Toma. Al-Andalus, one of the ways of starting to talk about this a little bit that I wanted to mention is that it's about shifting geographies, it's about shifting boundaries, it's about shifting meanings. And one of the debates that has taken place is where people say, what does Al-Andalus mean? So Al-Andalus is in the simplest possible expression, is the name that the Arabs themselves gave, the Arabic name that the Muslims gave to the territory under their rule in the Iberian Peninsula. That has led to some interesting discussions. Some people have said what it named, therefore, was a political entity. So that area of the peninsula that was ruled by Muslims, that's what was called Al-Andalus. And so as the frontier of Muslim rule decreased, so Al-Andalus decreased. So Andalus literally names a disappearing territory, a territory that is continuously shifting. Others have said that actually looking at the sources, we see that although it does name a political entity, it also names a geographical territory. So it did name the Iberian Peninsula as such. For our purposes, what I wanted you to take into account is the following, that if we think of Al-Andalus then, both as geography and politics, the most interesting thing, and here one thing will connect with my conclusion. The most interesting thing is first we must see it as a territory that belongs to the Umayyad Caliphate all the way from Damascus. Then we must see it as a territory that is the Umayyad Caliphate independent of Cordoba, centered in Cordoba. Then we must see it as part of the territories that fragment into what I call the Taifa party kings, the factional kings. Then as part of two large North African Berber empires, the Almoravid Empire and the Almohad Empire. And finally reduced to the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada. So try to picture it in your head. What you see literally changing is the geographies of what Al-Andalus belongs to. It belongs to a caliphate from Damascus to the west. It belongs to a thin line that runs from from the Berber west coast of Africa and North Africa to the Iberian Peninsula. It belongs to a thin little territory at the end of the Iberian Peninsula. What is it that we name when we speak of Al-Andalus? And the reason I'm pointing to this and pushing it a little bit is because we often say, and so often we say, it is this 800-year or almost 1,000-year period of Muslim rule in the peninsula. Let's be a little bit more critical about this, because not only do the geographical boundaries shift, but also the meanings of what was taking place in these territories change a lot. Over time, the relationship between the peoples, the process of Arabization, the process of Islamization, the process of material culture, the process of the ways in which people live together is very, very complex and very diverse. We continue to have, if we are truthful as historians, we continue to have a lot of gaps in information about what exactly was happening outside of cities. What was the reality in the countryside of rule, of life for ordinary peasants in these territories that were ruled by Muslims, and then that were ruled by Christians. Some of the archaeologists and some of the historians say it actually made not a jot of difference to some of the people on the land who it was that was ruling them, because realities changed, but their realities remained the same. Political realities changed, their realities remained the same. Life in the urban areas, of course, was very different. And much of what we associate when we conjure in our minds Al-Andalus is the beauty, is the tremendous cultural flourishing that occurs in the great centers, which when we visit, we find the great material presences of the Mosque of Cordoba, the Alhambra of Granada, and Seville, and so many other places. Now, I won't have time to go into all of these matters, but what I wanted to say, because it is important, is that the dominant theme in which people discuss, especially Arabs, but also Muslims' relation to Al-Andalus, is the notion of nostalgia. It's a nostalgia for a lost place. I want to complicate that a little bit, first by reminding that the concepts of nostalgia that we speak of when we talk about the 19th and 20th century, or even the present, have many different layers to them. One of them would be that when those who were expelled, Jewish and Muslim, from the Iberian Peninsula, they already produced much of literature, song, folk, poetry, etc., as well as folk memories that encoded some sense of loss, nostalgia that's already sedimented there. But then we go through some quite complex processes. So 19th century Jewish Enlightenment has a particular relationship to, which I'll mention in a moment, to the Muslim period of rule in the peninsula that already creates certain layers and certain lens through which to look at it. The fact that the United States constructs its image of its own empire, of its own whiteness, of its own civilization, by repressing the image or by darkening the image of the of the Spanish Empire, South America versus North America, the Spanish conquistadors and colonizers as opposed to the Anglo-Saxon ones. So this notion of what's called the Black Legend of Spain has a long history, and we can't just look at the way in which Muslims, for example, look at Muslim Spain without seeing the ways in which globally the image of Spain is impacted upon by many different sort of layerings of how that image is constructed. Northern European, French and English travelers who in the 19th century who go to Spain construct this sort of image of the Orient in Spain. You all know the expression, where Africa begins at the Pyrenees. So when you cross the Pyrenees, you are in Africa, you are in Moorish land. The suspicion that they had, northern travelers had when they traveled through Spain, that they were, wherever there is a Spaniard or a Portuguese, scratch the surface and you find a Jew or a Moor. So even though this was the land of Inquisition, the land of Catholicism, the land that expelled the Muslims and the Christians, really you can never really quite be sure if they aren't really Muslims and Jews. So there's a sort of orientalization of Spain. And what's interesting is that Spain itself and the Spanish start adopting many of these stereotypes and cliches and start trading on them. We know trading on them in the literal sense. If you go to Granada or Cordoba today, you know that you can buy Moorish heritage packaged for the tourist, but you trading on them also in the sense in which how they conceived their difference. So Andalusia, as a region of Spain, conceived of its difference from the rest of Spain on the basis of the period of Muslim rule. So this is the sort of the period of what is called the costumbristas, the Spanish who cultivated the difference of Spanish folk ways based on that past. This image is only to mention one thing about, I'm only going to say extremely briefly the following, that if we look at how Portugal under Salazar during the 20th century, 48 years of one of the longest dictatorships of Western Europe, the longest dictatorship of Western Europe, conceived of itself as a Catholic country, a country that was made literally by expelling and removing the Muslim from its territory. And so in 1947, when they did the commemorations of the conquest of Lisbon, the entirety of the celebrations was, I can give you a flavoring of it by telling you how the spectacle took place on the day. Shortly before midnight, very strangely indeed, all the lights of the city of Lisbon, the capital city of Portugal, were switched off. in the center of the town. And then, just shortly before midnight, a cross at the top of the castle was lit up, and gradually light spread from the cross and the castle across the city of Lisbon. So it was the advent of Christianity bringing Portugal into the light from the darkness of Muslim rule. And that was very much sort of symbolically the notion of how Portugal as a civilization, as a nation was made, by being Christianized, by being reconquered in the terms of the Conquista. If we look to 1997, after the Portuguese Revolution, when Portugal is trying to democratize itself, when it has decolonized, when it is trying to reinvent its own image, and suddenly we find that the commemorations of the fall of Lisbon in 1147 are suddenly celebrated as a crossroads of civilizations. Muslims and Christians, Mediterranean, and trade routes that span the globe met in that period, and the transformation that occurred when the English Crusaders stopped to conquer Lisbon was a rupture in the ways of life of a country that had been connected through Muslim rule to so much of the globe. So we find a complete transformation in the country's self-understanding of how to relate to its past before the reconquest and before the Muslims. And so what I'm saying is that we have many different ways in which nations are continuously looking back, reinventing, rethinking of how to integrate their past with their present and their future. If we look at this image, it's the other dictator of the Iberian Peninsula, Francisco Franco. Now, Franco here is being, of course, allegorized like the Santiago Matamoros, the Moor slayer, who is the national figure of the saint of Spain. And one of the things that many of you will know about the Spanish Civil War is that Franco literally conquered Spain, province by province, town by town, with the forces that he brought across from North Africa until he managed to defeat the Spanish Second Republic and impose his dictatorship on Spain. In this process, he called it a crusade, and it was seen as a crusade, a Catholic crusade for the truce of Spain against the forces of communism. The forces of communism that were often depicted as the forces of an Oriental despotism, which should therefore ring with all the tones of the Muslim presence. He was like the new reconqueror who was making Spain again. So how many of you know about this? That Franco's Guard of Honor was made up of Moroccan troops, what was called the Guardia Mora, the Moorish troops. Because Franco's army that literally conquered Spain was made up of a very large number, 70,000 if I remember, auxiliary troops from Morocco, recruited in Morocco, who then gained the reputation of being precisely among the most savage of the troops that were involved in the process of the Civil War. And one of the ways in which we find these sort of what I'm calling halls of mirrors, constructions, perplexing ways of thinking about this, is here you have Franco the Crusader conquering Spain with Moorish troops. And here we have Langston Hughes, the African-American poet, who goes to fight against fascism in Spain with the volunteers who came from all over the world to fight fascism in Spain. He's an African-American. He's there fighting for democracy against fascism, which he understands as also meaning against racism, because he sees racism as a form of fascism. And then he comes across a captive from the other side, from what he calls the fascist forces. And what is he? He's a Moor. And he simply can't understand. Wait a moment, I'm here, I'm an African-American, I'm here to fight against fascism, which is racism. And on the other side is another black man like me, who is fighting for fascism. I simply don't understand. And so he calls, in this poem, he starts talking about, I don't have time to go into all of this, but this poem sort of expresses the shock of what he saw. As you can see here, he talks about how fascism preaches the creed of Nordic supremacy in a world for whites alone, so he sees it very much as about questions of racism. And then he has to put this in terms of deluded Moors. So the Moors on the other side, those who are coming, they need to be decolonized too. So what they are fighting for in Spain is not just democracy and civilization, but it's for anti-colonialism that will eventually enable to spread across to the other side of the Straits of Gibraltar. This is about the way in which the Jewish Enlightenment picks up specifically on the elements of Al-Andalus in order to bring about a reconciliation between the kinds of reform and transformation that it was trying to enact and the concept of tradition. So how to achieve transformation within tradition. One model that it could look to is Al-Andalus. And in that sense, you may find it strange, why am I making a very quick reference to this? Because we are so often told that when Muslims look to Al-Andalus, this is some sort of nostalgic way of looking back into a lost past, a forgotten past, a past of imperial glory. But actually it's much more complicated than that, because we too trade on so much of the values that have been created, fostered, and celebrated by Jewish enlightened philosophers who were trying to create an image of Al-Andalus as flourishing in this period as a period of transformation. Now, I have entirely lost track of time, and so what I'm going to do is just give you a couple of snippets like this. If we look at some of the figures that have been important in shaping the way that we continue to think about Al-Andalus, we will see that they go from Cuba to the Philippines, from North Africa to the Middle East, from North America to Brazil. The concept of Al-Andalus has been extremely productive and valuable for all sorts of different groups to think of new ways of conceiving the future, the present, and not simply as some sort of longing for the past. When Lebanese and Syrian, in that period still under Ottoman rule, migrants to intellectual migrants and exiles to North America and to Brazil set up groups of poetry and literature and so on that were flourishing, they called themselves New Andalusia, because they were trying to conceive of periods of radical transformation of beauty and cultural production. What I want to mention in terms of how some of the notions have been generated about, so when did Al-Andalus become a sort of beacon for Muslims? Some have argued that this took place in the 1880s. They even fix it on a very specific date, around 1886. The notion being, the conventional argument goes, that it's linked to two things. You started getting Muslim and especially Arab travelers to Spain as a consequence of two things. One, there started a number of cultural missions of, for example, the Sultan sent cultural missions to Spain to collect Arabic manuscripts to take back to Turkey. So you started getting travelers, contemporary travelers going to Spain. And the other one was the Orientalist congresses that were taking place in Europe started receiving scientific contributions from Middle Easterners, from Orientals. And so that period of bringing contemporaries to Spain made a rediscovery of the Spanish past. Now, one argument is that this was also happening in British India as a consequence of the British Orientalists, who were particularly close to the experiments that were taking place around if you're familiar with Halis Musadas, for example, you will be very familiar with the notion of the stanzas that he dedicates to Spain and to Al-Andalus. And it's around the cultural production of the people that were associated with the Aligar movement. And so the notion is that the British Orientalists that were trying to sort of create a class of Muslims that identified with progress, with reform and so on, were inducing upon them a sort of strong attachment to the period when Muslim civilization was at its height in Spain. So we've got Middle Easterners traveling to Spain. We've got the Ottoman sultans becoming interested in Spain. We've got South Asian cultural production. And this starts transforming itself into poetry, into plays, into drama, into histories, and into a renewed interest in Spanish Al-Andalus. Now, I'll just quickly bring us to the fore with this. If we look at this one saying from Hussein Muniz, for example, in his travels in Al-Andalus, when Arabs visit Cordoba, they do not do so as other tourists do. For Arabs visit Cordoba as emigrants who return to their home and country. Everything may have changed there, but it is still their homeland, their country, their place of belonging. So the question is, do Arabs, and by extension Muslims, travel to Spain as a place to which they're returning? So with a different sensibility from others. If we look at this poem from The Voice of Al-Andalus, I saw Cordoba. I asked myself, what can matter such days that belong to the past, a past that has given them and has passed. So the notion is, how do we relate? Does it still belong to us? Is it something that connects with us, or is it something that is now relegated to the past? So it's the opposite attitude, I would say, to the one just mentioned. And Nizar Kabani's very famous Sorrows of Al-Andalus, which express both that notion of so little is left. I mean, you inquire of me because you have this notion that, this is the greatness, this is what you must tell me about. You wrote to me, my dear, to inquire about Spain. You asked me about Tariq ibn Ziyad, who in the name of God conquered the New World, about Uqba ibn Nafi, who planted palm trees on every hill. You wanted to know about Umayyad, the Prince Muawiyah, and the magnificent troops he sent from Damascus, the caravan of a new vitality of civilization. Nothing of us, of our 8 centuries there, is left in Spain. A little red residue at the bottom of a wine bottle, but our desert night sleeps in those big dark eyes. What has remained of Cordoba? The tears shed by her weeping minarets, or the memories of her roses, orange blossoms, and azaleas. It has been 5 centuries, my dear, but it feels like only today that we left Spain. So that mixed feeling both of something that is gone, of which nothing virtually is left, and yet which is so near, so present, so powerfully connected. Now, with Darwish, we find, of course, what one critic has argued, that Al-Andalus equals Palestine, equals Paradise Lost. And that this particular critic argues that it's not only the most prominent theme in Darwish's poetry from, many have argued from 67 for the Palestinians in general, but not just for Darwish, but for Palestinian poetry as a whole. It is the dominant form of identification of Palestine is Al-Andalus. And she says that Darwish's series of poems entitled 11 Stars on the End of the Andalusian Theme is one big long repetition of the equation Al-Andalus equals Palestine equals Paradise Lost. But how far does this go back? Well, one critic has argued that one of the first uses of it is in 1910, in Muhammad Kurd Ali's newspaper, where it says, "We fear that the new settler will expel the indigenous population and we will have to leave our country en masse. We shall then be looking back over our shoulder and mourn our land as did the Muslims of Andalusia." So that connection between expulsion and Al-Andalus in the relation to Palestine is there from at least this period and continues to reverberate today. And Palestine continuing to be that beacon of Muslim consciousness ties us back to this. Anyone know who this particular gem of advice to Sheikh bin Baz was? Which ends, of course, with the reference to the flag of unity being raised above the stolen land of Islam, beginning with Palestine and continuing to Al-Andalusia, and other lands of Islam lost due to the treachery of rulers and helplessness of Muslims. It is, of course, Osama bin Laden. Now, the other side of the equation, of course, is the clash of civilizations mongering. And we have seen how, in the context of that, Al-Andalus has become no longer referred to as Al-Andalus, but by so many of those who see Muslims and their presence as a problem and the Eurabia as a threat as the myth of Al-Andalus. So everything that we celebrate, that we talk about, that we find worth looking back to, they see is a mystification in order to enable that kind of creeping Islamization by creating this beacon, which was they call a distortion and an untruth. It helps to smooth the path to the notion, that convivencia is a possibility, when in fact it was all about bloody, violent imposition of rule by Muslim conquerors over people whom they subjugated. So the notion of convivencia, coexistence of peoples, the notion of Islamic presence in the Iberian Peninsula, the notion of Al-Andalus is now one of the most hotly contested topics, because it's not about the past at all, of course. It is about the present. And we know this when, after the Madrid bombings, José Rodríguez Zapatero, who came in as prime minister, having ousted Aznar, who had taken the Spanish troops to Iraq, he came into government, went to the UN and proposed the Alliance of Civilizations, which of course then Turkey backed and put forward. And in his opening lecture at Georgetown University, Aznar, who then went on to become from a fallen prime minister to a lecturer at university, that's a long way to go, he immediately dismissed that by saying, well, the problem is not of Spain with Al-Qaeda with Spain, is not since Spain sent troops to Iraq. The problem of Al-Qaeda with Spain, the problem of Muslims with Spain, is since 7/11. So this continuous sort of connecting of the issues of Al-Andalus with the issues of multiculturalism, the issues of convivencia with the issues of Eurabia is a very common theme. And I want to end with the following. One of the books that I mentioned earlier by Richard Fletcher, he talks about how the nostalgia, it's a very well-received academic work. The nostalgia of the Maghribi writers was reinforced by the romantic vision of the 19th century. So the first expelled Maghribis and then the 19th century Orientalist version. This could be flavored with a dash of Protestant prejudice against Anglo-Saxon world, a powerful mixture, but that is not yet the end of the receipt. In the second half of the 20th century, a new agent of obfuscation makes its appearance, the guilt of the liberal conscience, which sees the evils of colonialism, assumed rather than demonstrated, foreshadowed in the Christian conquest of Al-Andalus and the persecution of the Moriscos, but not oddly in the Moorish conquest and colonization. Stir the mixture well together and issue it free to credulous academics and media persons throughout the Western world, then pour it generously over the truth. But Moorish Spain was not a tolerant and enlightened society, even in its most cultivated epoch. And he thinks that as a historian, it is dangerous to propagate this. Now, some critics, interestingly, the only objection they have to this is they think, it's not that there's a problem in what he's saying. The problem is that in the context of clash of civilizations mongering, he's not helping. I actually would say that the issue is about whether or not the coexistence of peoples was as idyllic as some people claim. Of course it wasn't. The greater problem with Fletcher's book comes in the next bit, for me. It's where he argues this. In the vast perspective of human history, the critically important function of Moorish Spain was to act as a channel for the transmission of knowledge from east to west, at one of the most sensitive periods of Europe's rise to dominance. It is fashionable in some quarters to condemn this view as Eurocentric. This is rather bewildering. Like it or not, European hegemony is the most prominent feature in the history of the world between 1300 and 1900. Anything that may assist in explaining the rise of the West is presumably of interest to the historian, or should be. So we're right back to the notion that the history of the West is a triumphant history from 1300 onward. The hegemony goes back as far as that, as opposed to all of historiographical revisionism, which says that actually until the 18th century, we can't really talk about European hegemony. But more importantly, we go back to the notion that all that the Muslim presence in Spain or on the Iberian Peninsula did was to act as the postman. to bring the knowledge of the classics to Western civilization, traveling through that period of darkness so that they could flourish in the Renaissance. That, I think, is the fundamentally problematic aspect of Richard Fletcher's book. And I wanted to end on the following, that I think that what is at stake in this issue of Al-Andalus is not really so much some of, I think, Muslims' investment. What is problematic is not the nostalgic aspect. It's not the fact that we look to empire when it's ours is okay, when it's theirs isn't, and that kind of comment. It's the fact that some of what is valued about it is itself Muslims contributing to the notion that what was in Spain under the Muslims was unique and exceptional, as opposed to what was happening under Muslim rule elsewhere in terms of convivencia. And the reason being, it seems implicitly, because it was in Europe. The exceptionality of it is, this is the one place where Muslims were in Europe. But this is why I started with the disorientations that I did. If Al-Andalus was part of this caliphal geography, of this political space and entity, it was not in Europe. It may have been physically in the territory that we now call the land mass of Europe, but it was part of a geopolitical and a geographical conception that was entirely of the Muslim world. And if Europe and the West is established by opposition to Islam and the Muslim world, then it was not part of Europe. And so it's by what I'm trying to suggest is that rather than being about otherness, what we want to do is what Stuart Hall was hinting at with his unsettling, is what the sociological imagination demands of us when we see things in terms of those broader connections. It's in terms of that return to the source I was talking about. It's really about challenging the conceptions of history that we tell and that enable us to narrate Al-Andalus not as part of the history of Europe, but as part of a global history which made the world that it is today and which is everything that is not what Richard Fletcher has said. Okay.
We have time for questions from either side.
Abdulkarim, thank you for that. Of course, you referred to Altaf Hussain Ali and Iqbal, both who have tangential relationship to Andalus. Iqbal's slightly more than Ali. Ali, I don't think ever visited Andalusia, just in his imagination. What I'm more interested in is that when we, I've done only very superficial reading on that, the kind of presence of Muslims in Cordoba, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, from what I could figure out, they were suggestions that there were like anything between 700 to 1,000 mosques in Cordoba.
Yeah.
Now, that is not a presence of invaders. Even today, to find 1,000 mosques in any city is a very difficult job. So there must have been a lot of indigenous acceptance of the faith, yeah? Now, that will obviously refute what this vision is saying, that this was a transient invasion, brutal and whatever else. It was, by all accounts, in that sense, very cultured presence, if you like, yeah? I think that probably needs a little bit more investigation. And empirically, I think hints in his Under the Pomegranate Tree, and Amin Malouf also looks at a little bit on that. So that's one. The other one is that this general problem of the West, that Muslims somehow were safe deposit boxes for Greek and Roman knowledge, which ultimately we got it back without them having interfered in it in any way. This is obviously ridiculous, but that's what it is. This is wider than even Andalusia. That, because otherwise you need to account for what was the Muslim contribution to that heritage, and which is itself problematic for them. So I don't know if you have any.
Well, two things. One is it's really, really important that when we think of Al-Andalus, we really take into account that any historical process spanning a period from 711 to 1492 is going to be immensely varied in its forms of expression. But more importantly, as you say, regardless of how much discussion we may have about the rural areas, about areas that we don't know much about the backwaters, which is what Portugal was largely in relation to the main core of what we think of when we think of Al-Andalus. When we are talking about Cordoba, when we're talking about Granada, when we're talking about Seville, when we're talking about Jaén, when we're talking about so many of these other places, we're talking about densely populated, largest cities of Europe at that time, with the most flourishing of cultures, but also at other times, periods of tremendous infighting, politicking, division, etc. So we often talk about the book burning that occurred after the conquest of Granada, but of course there were book burnings during the Muslim period too. We need conceptions of history in which we are open to all the different diversities of both beauty and ugliness that make up history. But what we can't accept is the kind of versions like Claudio Sanchez Albornoz that I mentioned, who has written his first intervention on this was 1,400 pages long. He has written many, many more besides without knowing a word of Arabic. And yet, absolutely at the age of 89, he came back on the field and wrote a book because he was disturbed by news that there were people in Andalusia who were reclaiming the Islamic past and, worst of all, who were converting into Islam. And he said, as a lifelong liberal, and he had been in exile against the Franco regime, as a lifelong liberal, I cannot, however, but want these people to be sent to the Middle East because they became converts. Because they don't realize that what they're doing is they're converting to the faith that enslaves women, that represses culture, and that has never contributed anything to civilization or Spain. How can we allow and challenge these kinds of notions? And when we do, we said that we are nostalgic, harking back to the imperial past and so on. We want critical history, but we want a critical history that is openly, critically discussed by all those who have something to contribute to it. The second issue that you raised about the Muslim contribution, fortunately, we're no longer in the period in which this is erased and denied. We are told that it's the opposite now. It's so rosy and mystified that it needs to be refuted because otherwise it becomes dangerous. But fortunately, we do have a great deal of intellectual academic work that has been done on this. The problem is the disconnect between the fantastic academic work that gets done and then what gets produced at the level of what reaches the majority of the people. And we need to connect those two things better.
Any questions from either side?
Assalamu alaikum. This concept that you talked about, the fact that obviously the Christians were ruling, the Muslims came and took over, and then obviously Christians came back again and ruled. Is it any easier for the people who live there when the Muslims were ruling or when the Christians are ruling? I mean, when we look at, for example, at this moment, the Morocco or that area, or the Muslim places where they ruled, and where, for example, Spain or Portugal is ruled. I mean, I don't know, but I think there's much more freedom in Spain and Portugal than there would be in these areas. So what's the big deal if the Christians rule or whatever? Which one is better for the people? I mean, are you saying that the Muslims were treating the people a lot better before and then it changed? So the fact that just because Muslims are ruling doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be any better than for the mass of people. So I just wonder whether you have any comment on that.
Well, firstly, I never said that it was better under Muslims, but I could say that. But but regardless, it's not what I said. What I did say is that the question of how people's fared under different forms of rule has become an extremely politicized one in terms of the image of the past. So the notion first that you had Christians and then Muslims conquered and then Christians came back is already problematic, because we don't actually know how Christianized the Iberian Peninsula was at the time. It was Romanized, definitely. We also don't know how Islamized it was under Muslim rule. So what we do know is that different political systems and rulers ruled over this peninsula, and that peoples under them fared differently with different cultures and spreads of religions in the period. What we do know is that Jewish communities, for example, under the Visigothic rule, were persecuted, and precisely because they fared better under Muslim rule after the initial conquest, they were seen as traitors who had brought. There's a lot of myths about, it was they who brought the Muslim expeditions in, etc., etc. Of course, during the period of Muslim rule, it also fared very differently for Jews at different times. At times, they had perfectly advantageous lives with very good incursions into the established Muslims' ways of life, and other times they were persecuted and expelled and even threatened. So we have many different periods of time, and we can't conflate it into one. But what I did say very clearly is that, or one thing we haven't touched on sufficiently, because I said I wasn't going to deal with the medieval period. When we talk about the ways in which the pact, the communities under the pact are tolerated, the Christians, Muslims, and Jews, the peoples of the book under Muslim rule, we know that it wasn't a textbook notion of this is what the Quran says, this is what gets applied. There were many different ways in which politics played its part in this. But it was certainly fared better, religious minorities fared better under Muslim rule than they did under Christian rule. That the historical record shows. Am I saying, therefore, that if Muslims were to rule the Iberian Peninsula today, everybody would be better off? I said no such thing, of course. I'm not making any kind of connections about that. What I'm saying is that when Muslims do value and do look to Andalusia and have special kinds of attachments to it, to see this as colonial nostalgia or the inability to live in the present because we're always looking to the past, that is what I'm challenging. I think that there is more about the ways in which we're trying to do that, which is simply to challenge the version of history that we are presented as the only kind of history that we must subordinate ourselves into. Alaikum salam.
Sorry, assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for the talk. I just had two slight comments to make. When thinking of Spain, one often conjures up the image of orange groves, almond trees, and a generation, perhaps 2 generations before, sugarcane, and the origin of sugar within Spain, all of which, of course, would have come from further east and settled within a rural population and had a significant impact in the way that the Spaniards or Iberians saw themselves and structured their societies, changes which could not have happened and could not have been entrenched within this if we had a world in which we had a predominantly Christian rural population that lived upon the land and farmed it with a thin, transient Muslim elite restricted to towns. And I think another thing that points to the extent to which a Muslim presence within the Iberian Peninsula is entrenched, in which its roots draw deeply from the ground there, is the persistence of a Muslim presence well beyond 1492. So 1492, when Boabdil leaves Granada and signs a covenant, a pact with Ferdinand and Isabella, guaranteeing the freedom of religious worship for all of his subjects, Muslim and Jew, which the Catholic king and queen then subsequently tear up on entry into Granada. There's a Muslim presence within the region for another 100 years. And even in areas that had been subject to the Reconquista beforehand, you have Muslims persisting, writing Spanish in Arabic script, maintaining private libraries, continuing with the transmission of their religion, even under difficult circumstances. And even when the Inquisition comes in and records it, persisting in that at least 150 years after the fall of Granada.
Mm-hmm.
But what I wanted to find out was whether you could draw out some more on the background to the idea of the convivencia. Why you have Spanish historians going back and looking at the possibility of living in a plural society. Particularly when the Crusades, the Reconquista, its precursor, is presented as an inevitable part of history. Perhaps our return and re-examination of this and looking at it in a different way provides us with a new role for how we see where we live today.
Okay, two very short answers, but first just a preliminary one, which is, fortunately, anthropology is contributing a lot to more than history, to the ways in which we are coming to re-understand the period, because we're not so stuck with the chronicles, which are very ideological in the way that they represent what was going on, and especially from the point of view of power and battles and wars and so on. Some have often always put as another way of approaching things, literature and folk culture, because it preserves a much more from the ground up kind of view. But anthropology and anthropological archaeology has enabled material culture to speak and to show how precisely the ways of life, the kinds of foods that were eaten, the ways that houses were built, the ways that communities interacted, changed and didn't change under this period, which is a very long period. And so that is helping us to understand in very different ways, much less ideologically loaded ways, how life in the period was and was not transformed. And one of the dominant paradigms is the notion of a Mediterranean culture, and that the Mediterranean culture doesn't really change with the vicissitudes of changing power, but in much slower rhythms of climate, of transhuman movements of peoples and so on, and flows of seeds and animals and so on. And so that enables us to see how our ways of thinking about history are really sort of a thin veneer on something much larger. But how and when did these concepts of convivencia come to the fore? Well, for some, the explanation is very simple. So the 19th century is a century of history and of nation building. It's when Spain and Portugal have their liberal revolutions, and having overthrown absolute rule, are creating constitutional regimes with liberal political cultures that have to form national cultures and citizenships. And so you need national imaginaries. And they look back to the medieval period because that was the period of freedoms, the period of the emergence of the first parliaments, of expressions of peoples and so on. And in that context, those who were forging these cultures were liberals fighting against absolutism, and absolutism was associated with the Inquisition. So what would be the opposite of that? It would be some sort of sense of recognition of the religious minorities that were persecuted by this culture of clericalism, of church, and of absolute power. And so one of the arguments is that the interest in religious pluralism and the diversity of religious life was motivated by the political contest between conservatives and liberals, and had nothing to do with Muslims or interest in Muslims or Judaism itself. It was internal political battles about the values that were central to the nation. And so that is why some others then extend this to the Franco period and say Franco was about dictatorship, It was about national Catholicism, so quite clearly the anti-fascists were the ones who celebrated the convivencia. And Americo Castro, the guy who coined the concept of convivencia, lived in exile since 1930s, expelled by the precisely to escape the Franco regime in the US, in Argentina, in Mexico, and so on. So he would be precisely sort of embodiment of the stance against Franco. That is complicated because Claudio Sanchez Albornoz, his biggest rival, was also in exile from the Franco regime. So it wasn't the sort of political coloring of whether you were a fascist or not that made you a Muslim friendly or not, and especially not when Franco was ruling with the Muslim guards. So I like to think that the story is more complicated than those kinds of divisions. But there is no question that today, the reason we impart so much importance and focus on the question of convivencia is as a result of the challenges to the notion of peaceful coexistence, of religious plurality in the context where Muslims are problematized as a singularly, excessively incapable of dealing with religious plurality and values of convivencia. So that's looking back to the notion of the period when Muslims were the sort of the limelight of the very concept is why so many Muslims turn to it. And for the other side is in order to expose what they see as the myth of that moment of beacon. I hope it answers your question to some extent.
Thank you very much. I think
anecdotal, but Maimonides, who was one of the more versatile philosophers, Jewish philosophers in Cordoba. Now, the biblical prohibition on usury is common to all the three Abrahamic faiths, so there is no dispute about that. The Jews traditionally have rationalized it that it is a prohibition between them. So therefore, between Jews you cannot take riba, but if somebody is not a Jew, then you are fine. That's okay, that's one interpretation they have done. Maimonides, on the other hand, goes further, and I don't know if there is some lesson there. He says, not only you can take, you must take from a non-Jew. Now, does that reflect some kind of pressure in that society on their thinking of, enmity? Because to now make it mandatory rather than possibility is indicative of something more. The second point is that in terms of tolerance, if you go to North African cities, say Marrakesh or Fez or whatever, you always find a very well-structured Jewish quarter. Now, I guess this must have been established by those Jews who were expelled from Al-Andalus, and because of the requirements of the Sabbath and so on, they must have been given a place where they could feel comfortable. And so that shows a level of tolerance even then, which would have been replicated, I suppose, in Muslim Andalusia. So I don't think there is any dispute about that.
Sure.
I think we'll end the salawat.